be seated. Well, good morning to all of you and happy Easter on this beautiful Easter Sunday morning. Lovely to see you here. We had a big crowd at 9 and we got a big crowd again, so it's wonderful to celebrate with so many of you. So many of you probably know that I go on a walk most days of the week. And usually when I'm out walking, I take the same route, and I always pass by this very large, beautiful field. It's never planted with anything other than wheat straw because it's used for grazing for the cows that are part of Chapel Hill Creamery that's nearby to where we live. So last week, the creamery did a controlled burn of the field that I walked by. They shored up the edges of the field and then they burned all the vegetation inside. It's a way to return the nutrients to the soil more quickly than just letting the vegetation decompose on its own. And when they do these burns, which they do every now and again, they pay a lot of attention to the edges. The edges where the neighbors like me live, the physical edges of the field itself that they trench and saturate with water before the burn. And then when they actually do the burn, they station people along each side of the rectangle. They pay a lot of attention to the edges. So in my mind, this is the image that I hold when I think about this first Easter Sunday and those women who went back to the tomb after Jesus' death. The women who kept watch, who go to the edge of a burning field, Jesus' crucifixion. They go there to tend to the edges of Jesus' physical broken body, to tenderly care for it, watching, expecting who knows what. But they come to the tomb. That's the image I've been holding in my mind for this Easter Sunday. Now, I know it's not a soft, fuzzy, warm image for Easter, and I'm sorry to disappoint you about that if you're disappointed. It is out of sync a bit with our traditional notions of Easter, the ones that come easier to us, like Easter egg baskets, colorful eggs, spring flowers, bunnies, and most importantly, chocolate. And I'm not opposed to any of that. I'm not knocking it at all. But Mark's image of the risen Jesus, his Easter story, runs a little deeper than that. And in Mark, it's actually only an assurance of the risen Jesus that they get from the angel. There aren't even any appearances in Mark like the other Gospels. And yet, in my mind, it's where the power and the depth and the inexplicable strength of this Christian faith is found, at the edges of the burning field and with those who returned to it and then moved forward. Mark, of all the Gospels, makes this most clear. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome come in the very early hours to the tomb where Jesus was laid. Their lives were in danger. Everything they had hoped for was lost. They were women who stood at the edges of their own culture and world, much like Jesus. And they had watched him be executed brutally by the Roman authorities and even by religious ones in power. But despite all that, despite the risk, the fear, the sorrow, they went back. And they carried with them this tenderness and this deep courage that helped them to go back, to anoint Jesus' body, to prepare him for burial. It's such a tender act of devotion mingled with grief, this exquisite gesture of love, the kind of love that Jesus had taught them, that he had talked about. On the way to their tomb, they wonder, how will they get this stone rolled away? Seemingly an impossible task. But they keep moving forward even as they wonder. Tombs in that day were hewn out of the rock. If you've ever traveled to Jordan or the Middle East, you might have seen one or even been in one, but they're massive. And they're like big caves, and they have stone shelves as you walk in, multiple stone shelves carved into them on either side. We don't know whose tomb it was where Jesus' body was laid. Maybe Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus, two other people of great courage. The stone is gone when they get there, and the angel says, "Do not be afraid." They'd heard those words before, and so have we if we've been following the narrative of Jesus through the Gospel of Mark. Gabriel tells Mary not to be afraid when she's told she will bear a child. Or then there are all those stories of Jesus with the disciples when the storm comes up, when the crowds get to be too much, where the disciples think they won't have enough to feed them, and Jesus always says, "Peace, be still, don't be afraid." The angel tells them the same. Don't be afraid, he is risen. He's gone ahead to Galilee. Go and tell all the others. So the women leave terrified and amazed, and curiously, it says they said nothing to anyone. All of that to me doesn't seem like much to run on. An empty tomb, the word of the angel, fear. Whatever it was, though, the women must have pushed through their fear because word somehow spread, and here we all are after all. The story was told again and again and again. But this is where it all began. Mary Magdalene, Mary, Salome, paying attention to the edges out of love, out of sacrificial love, going to the poignant edge of their own grief and love, in a world where they weren't welcome, where they stood at the edge, in a risky world, at the edge of their own fear. And when they get there, and out of motivation to care for Jesus, and they go and they find an angel who tells them Jesus is risen, he goes ahead, you're not alone, and it is enough. Something happened at those edges. A renewed hope and trust, the courage they needed to move forward and to find their voice somehow in that burning field. And a community began to take shape around the risen Lord that's continued all the way to here, all the way to St. Matthew's. It's a gospel story about staying present and open at the edges of your world, of your mind, of what is bearable or possible or impossible. Edges you don't want to go to because of others or maybe because of fear, but that hold somehow the seeds of hope, of renewal. We know not how, but they hold somehow the seeds of hope and renewal and of God's eternal, ongoing presence, whatever those edges are for each of us, for our community of faith. So I ask, what are the edges of your world? The places that feel scary or impossible or hopeless or churning, or maybe even just like you don't have enough time for them, don't have enough time to go there and you don't want to. What I would say is pay attention to those edges. There's rich soil there, the risen Lord, resurrected life. Pay attention and have courage. I've got two stories to share that sort of weave in these themes. The first is about Alma Thomas, who was an artist in DC. She's now deceased. She's African American. She's from Georgia, but she spent much of her life in DC. Alma Thomas grew up in the Episcopal Church, at that time the segregated Episcopal Church. And she remained a lifelong Episcopalian her whole life, all despite the church that segregated her for so many years. She spent 35 years teaching at Shaw Junior High School in DC, and along the way, she earned an MA in arts education at Columbia and studied art at American University. Until she retired, she couldn't paint. There was no time, there was no encouragement, there was no space for her to find her place in the world of painting. For her, it was at the edge of what was really possible. But when she retired, she moved into that edge that for her was life, and she began to paint. And she began to push beyond the boundaries of what she'd learned into abstract art. And she developed her own signature style, dabs of vibrant colors with different rhythms and shapes. She painted things in her kitchen, from her garden, what she read about, things at the edge of her own knowledge. And I brought one here today. You'll see it up here. This one's called Eclipse. There had been an eclipse and she wanted to paint it, but it was at the edge of what she could see and imagine. So this teacher who taught for 35 years and then begins painting, returning to the love of her heart, returns to painting. And now today, her work is sought after around the world. There's a special exhibit right now at the American Art Museum at the Smithsonian. One of her pieces was purchased by the Obamas, and it hung in the dining room of the White House when they were there. At the center of that one was this yellow orb, and those who sat at the table during that time said that painting at the end of the table, that its light radiated across the room. Alma called that painting Resurrection. Miss Thomas had plenty of burning fields to discourage her. Here's what she says about growing up. She says, one of the things we couldn't do growing up was go into museums, let alone think of hanging our pictures there. My times have changed, just look at me now. This was an edge imposed on her that she reclaimed for herself. And she had the courage to move into it, trusting, believing in herself and her gifts, despite the burning field that said she couldn't. That's what I'm talking about, moving into the edge of love, of inner beauty and creativity in a world where other edges have been imposed, and then having faith. The second story is about another African-American artist, this one a music professor at Duke whose name's Anthony Kelly. So during COVID, when everyone was isolated, he was watching a documentary about Mary Lou Williams, famous African-American musician who wrote tunes for Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie. In the late 70s, Mary Lou Williams was an artist in residence at Duke. This was at the end of her career. And she had cancer, she wasn't well, but she was working on this final piece that she wanted to complete. A piece that she thought would combine all the parts of the music that she loved writing, ragtime, gospel, and swing. And she called this piece History. She died before she could finish it. And so all this was mentioned in the documentary at the very end of it. And it's funny, Kelly says that he was almost falling asleep at the end of the movie, and he heard these words, and he just kept coming back that there was this piece that she'd written that was lost. Nowhere to be found, never to be performed. And so he got intrigued about this, and he began a years-long search to find it. And after multiple efforts, endless dead ends, they finally found it. It was stuffed away in a cardboard box in the basement of the music archives at Duke, where it had sat for 40 years incomplete. 40 sheets of paper tied together with string of this masterful musician. She'd outlined the different parts: introduction, suffering, spiritual number 1, spiritual number 2, gospel, ragtime, and there were some parts that she hadn't finished. A gem in the basement at the edge. I just read on Friday that this past Friday, Good Friday, had been declared Mary Lou Williams Day at Duke. And her final piece, History, will be performed in April for the first time at Duke's Baldwin Auditorium, because someone paid attention to the edges. Paying attention to the edges, what's in the basement, the last, the lost, the least, the waning, to the treasure archived away, hidden in the basement of your mind, of this world, because someone said it didn't matter. Going there, standing there, and keeping your eyes open. Listening for the angel, the muse, trusting and hoping in the one who goes ahead, who is with us whether we know it or not, whether we name it or not, but whose life and creativity and spirit are what continue to renew this world every day and go before us. Trusting in that. Do not be afraid. Amen.
Amen.